So welcome everyone to our Pharma multi-channel marketing meetup, which is quite a mouthful. I'm Christine MacKay, CEO and producer at Salamander UK, and we are visual problem solvers using animation for business on any platform. So this marketing meetup is really a group for everyone working in the pharmaceutical industry, interested in learning about more multi-channel marketing and featuring presentations from our channel experts from within and without the industry. Members are encouraged to share best practice, ABPI compliant case studies, and we welcome group discussion at the end of the events. Our format is that we have at least 3 speakers on various topics with Q&A at the end. So put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll get them all answered by our panel speakers at the end, if that's okay. So this is our 16th event since October 2018. We've got 679 members. We've had 913 bums on seats, and today we've got 72 guests registered. So I'm going to introduce you now to James Harper, who's a co-founder of this meetup, and I will put it in your hands, James.
Thanks very much, Christine. Welcome, everybody. Most of you probably know me, but just briefly, James Harper, and the founder, manager director 28B. We are Veeva CRM, CLM experts, and we support agencies in optimizing their use of Veeva for brand teams. And that actually leads me very nicely into today. One of the areas that is obviously of interest, because you're here, is modular content. It's kind of a bit of a buzzword, etc. So we've got some great speakers lined up to take us through that. But just briefly, I speak to a lot of agency owners, agency partners, and there's initial concern around modular content of it being a potential threat to the way that we work. That is, if modular content is produced at a global level that is only localized for use, what happens to our revenue streams? What happens to the content we want to produce? But what I hope we'll get from today is actually see this not as a threat, but as an opportunity. That as we move to more scientific content, that if that content is compliant and available, that actually the budgets aren't going to go away. The budgets will allow us to do the more creative, more interesting, more personalized engagement because that modular content exists. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce John and Tessa in a second. We're going to do the first talk, which is really around Veeva's solutions on this and an industry perspective, because as you know, Veeva have a large view of the industry and what's going on. And then we'll move to Dr. Felix Jackson from medDigital, because of course there's going to be compliance issues with the idea of modular content. What about final form? Getting your head around how this is going to work. And then we'll move to a discussion. But for full transparency, unfortunately, Felix has to jump at 1 o'clock, so we're going to move fairly swiftly through these. If you have any specific questions or you want to engage with Felix afterwards, we can put you in touch. And get him hopefully to answer the questions if they come up and we don't answer them as a team at the end. So let me talk about John and Tessa. So John Fisher, for those of you who don't know him, Senior Project Manager at Veeva, so responsible for supporting Veeva Vault product suite with agency partners. A lot of you probably already know him. I've spoken many times with John and presented with John, so I'm looking forward to his take on modular content. He's had 4 years at Veeva and 10 years agency prior to that, so extremely well versed in the agency world, but also the brand team world as well. Speaking with John is Tessa. Tessa Strudwick was your pre-married name, and I forgive me, I should have asked how to pronounce Tessa Kojak. Forgive me, but Tessa works with John on the Veeva Content Partners side in the UK and Eastern Europe, and has a particular skill set in the multi-channel content certification program, and is our go-to for when we have problems in that space. Like John, she has many years experience in agency and content space. So without further ado, going to hand over to Tessa and John.
Great, thanks, James. Let me share my screen. All right. Seeing slides okay? Great. So thanks everyone for joining, and James and team, thanks for asking us to be part of this. It's exciting times. We've had a lot of conversations with a lot of you and others around this as we kind of move forward and talk to customers about this, and as customers are talking to you and your teams about going down this path to modular content. What is it going to look like? What's it going to entail? Setting the stage a little bit, 2020 really accelerated the shift to digital, right? And a lot of that, just a direct result of what COVID introduced to the industry, introduced to the world as a whole. And in that, if we look at some of the numbers back from 2020, from the year prior, it was, we saw an 80% increase in content, not surprisingly, 3.5 times more digital content than print content, and, well over 15, million assets managed within PromoMats over the course of the year there. When we look at, when we look at those numbers and we look at really what does that mean, it really accelerated what customers were looking to do, when it comes to content. They needed to be able to react. They needed to be able to do things better, essentially, right? Because, that acceleration uncovered some inefficiencies, especially when they're trying to react to something quickly like COVID as a whole. When we look at those numbers, we look at talking to our customers, obviously from our perspective, from a product perspective, the idea that we want to, put solutions out there that really meet customers' needs, right? And PromoMats and the MedComms platform, really sit at the center of a customer's content supply chain, really being the single source of truth for content and giving them the opportunity to manage and get that content out to the different channels accordingly. And you and your teams, obviously well aware of both platforms, maybe more so on the PromoMat side, as MedComms is a newer product, and you might not be working as much in that. But, when we talk about the two, specifically from an agency perspective, I really say they're sister products. If you know PromoMats and you work in PromoMats with your customers today, if they adopt MedComms or you work with other customers that are using MedComms, you're going to see a lot of similarities between how they work from your perspective. There are specific feature sets for each of them, but overall, you're going to be able to catch on pretty quickly. And when we start to talk about modular content as a whole, it's really part of the content maturity as a whole for a customer. And so when we look at these 3 buckets, you'll see different bits and pieces in here. A lot are going to be familiar. When we look at the transformative bucket, some of those are going to be kind of future forward thinking. But when we talk about foundation, right at the top from an MLR perspective, so review and approval. Obviously, customers, you're using it today to manage review and approval of content. Beyond that, PromoMats evolved to be a solution for digital asset management. Tessa will talk a little bit about that today. But we already have customers that have gone full in and using PromoMats as their solution for digital asset management to support their process overall. End of 2019, we launched the ability to manage a customer's claims library and use tools around that in the creation of content, the review and approval of content. Tessa will talk a little bit about that as well. And when we also look at foundational, we're talking about, content standards, content utilization, actually looking at how content is being used. What are the standards and such around that to kind of create some of those efficiencies across the boards, across different therapeutic areas, across different brand teams. Moving into the mature bucket, you see that modular content is really just a bullet here. There's more to it. And on the next slide, we'll talk about, modular content isn't just kind of its own thing. It really is part of this bigger journey as a whole that sets us up for some of the things that are in this transformative bucket. So just cherry picking a few here, the top one, the idea of, potentially in the future having artificial intelligence or machine learning involved in the review process. Having dynamic personalized content, having these dynamic templates. As James said, before coming to Veeva about 4 years ago, I spent 10 years on the agency side. This is something that, we've all been talking about for quite some time. I finally feel that we're starting to get down this path to get to a point where we're going to be able to support some of this content. And it's not so much from a technology side, it's more from the customer process side, the customer understanding. We're evolving the product to be able to help to support as they evolve their process as well. So when we talk about the path to modular, it really falls into, these 5 buckets. And this is stuff that we've been talking about. If we've had any conversation to date around modular content, or you've been part of any of our other webinars, modular content isn't, just this one thing. It's there's things that need to happen ahead of time to get a customer to a place where they're actually going to be able to use and work with modular content. And then that's going to set the stage for that kind of future forward transformative, the items you saw in the previous slide. So when we talk about, where do they need to start? It's really getting, process and, solution around digital asset management in a good spot. That's going to give them the assets, the component assets, all the different bits and pieces in a spot that they can then start to use with modules as they create those modules. Same thing with claims. We have the ability for them to build out their claims library, use that claims library. The same thing with their reference library. And that, going down a path of where they look at that at kind of that global level down to each market, but really centralizing those claims and references in one spot and having, some ownership around those helps keep it cleaner, helps it keep it easier to use, and then track that moving forward. And then it gets into, modular content planning, and the three of those can kind of happen at the same time, really get the path set forward. And, we have customers that have been going through that process this year as we, go down this path to modular content. And once that modular content plan's in place, once, assets, taxonomy, claims, references, et cetera, are all in a good spot, that's when we can start to look at actually executing with content as a whole there from a modular perspective and setting the stage for the future. And I'll close out with this slide as well, just to kind of back to it after we look at some of these different bits and pieces. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Tessa, and Tessa's going to talk a little bit about digital asset management and how PromoMats helps to support that, as well as claims feature.
Wonderful. Thanks, John, and thank you, everyone. So before I get into talking about the Vault PromoMats side of this, as a refresher, I just wanted to quickly recap on what digital asset management is. As we go through this, I'll be speaking about it as DAM to make things a little bit quicker. But digital asset management is a business process for the organizing, storing, and retrieving digital assets and managing digital rights and permissions. So in essence, that really means that DAM is more around process changes than around the technology. So when we talk about Vault PromoMats as a DAM, what this really means is that PromoMats is the technical solution, whereas DAM is the process that takes place within this solution. And so we all know on the call here today, PromoMats historically and today serves as a review and approval tool for many customers. But these customers are also starting to use DAM in conjunction with review and approval. And that's where the true benefits of PromoMats as a DAM comes in, around that integration of the medical, legal, and regulatory review process and DAM together so that all of a customer's content is within one spot. DAM isn't a new process to the industry, but historically what was often the case is a customer's DAM sat in a third-party solution. And what this really meant is it created inefficiencies where content needed to be moved after it had gone through approval, metadata needed to be recreated, and this meant that reporting and linking between different assets was lost as updates needed to be made. And so the true benefit around having all of your resources in one spot is that all of the teams working on that content, from agency to marketing to operations to medical, legal, and regulatory teams, they're all working in the same space on the same asset. And PromoMats can support any type of file content that is needed for the storage and management of assets within there, as we can see on the screen here. So when we start to discuss DAM for life sciences, we've got three different main types of digital assets. It's going to start here looking at that final piece, what we refer to as the composite material. So this asset could be a flat PDF, where the artwork goes to a website or a publishing house, or it could be a detail aid where that is being used in the field by the reps. So these are generally assets that are rich with metadata from that created files, and that metadata can be supported directly within PromoMats as well. And they tend to have complex approval systems. Most of you on the call here will probably spend a lot of time going through the approval for these assets to get them out in the field. And when we look at it from a DAM perspective, there's a relationship here back to what we call component assets, in that this final piece is being created from those assets to make it up. So it's going to be utilizing multiple logos, images, charts, just to name a few, to help make up that final composite material. And we got up on the screen about related to adaptions. And what that means here is once that final piece has been created, it can be adapted for another purpose. So whether it's for use in another region, from global to local, or between multiple countries, or for another channel. And with these adaptions within PromoMats, there can be linking between these materials, so we can see that connection and how it's being used. So the second major type here we're looking at is what we call component assets. And so these are everything that makes up composite materials, as we touched on before. So this could be a 3D model, a graph, it could be stock photography, or it could even be font types. And these, again, are enriched with metadata that's supported in PromoMats, though these generally go through a more simple approval process. Generally, on the customer side, it'd be someone in something like the role of a DAM librarian or content moderator that then approve these to be able to be used. But these component assets have a relationship within PromoMats to that final piece. And the importance there is around understanding how a piece is being used. So for example, if we look at a component asset graph that's been expired and it's no longer able to be used, through PromoMats, you can quickly identify what composite materials contain this graph and then be able to make those updates and those changes. And then finally, this is also the third type here is looking at references. And so these need to be tied back to claims within PromoMats and support both component and composite assets. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the next section. So while we've got a lot of features in PromoMats, I wanted to call out a few specific and really valuable ones related to the DAM processes we've got. And so first off, there's a feature called Vault Digital Publishing. And so this allows for the surfacing of approved content directly from Vault via a URL. So to take a back step on this, if you think about content that's been approved within Vault and it needs to be used in a website, in a portal, by social media. Once that's been approved within PromoMats, it would have needed to be downloaded and made available via that channel. And so that means that a single asset can exist in multiple places at once. And that can end up being a compliance risk. Through digital publishing, which works with an integration with Amazon Web Services, this means that the content can remain living within Vault PromoMats. And we create within the system URLs for each document and rendition type that can then be used for an email campaign, for a website, for a social channel, without that source content ever needing to leave Vault. And so what this then means is that the content can be easily updated or withdrawn all at once if needed. So it's a really quick and easy way to make changes. You saw on the last slide, touching on around rights management. Obviously, composite materials, component assets all generally need to have rights management around those. And Vault includes really powerful rights management with, from straight out of the box, workflows, metadata, and automated expiry being stored against each asset. So you're able to know and capture the information around if it's rights managed and if there's any restrictions on use. We've also got what we call auto image renditions, which is around allowing for multiple system generated renditions of a file. So this can come in handy if you think, for example, around photos from a photo shoot, where you can able to specify the sizes that these should be. So on the upload of the file, it's automatically created and associated without additional work needed to be done to get them into PromoMats. Vault has really open APIs. And so this then means we're able to support robust integrations with third-party partners that have created plugins and integrations with their platforms. And this enables Vault to remain as that single source of truth for content. So we think about the numerous component assets that you would have in PromoMats. These are all approved. By having integration with, say, Adobe Experience Manager, you're able to see within Adobe all those approved component assets that can then be pulled into a landing page or used with digital tactics being created without having to move content around. And then lastly, Vault has really detailed content performance reporting and dashboards. So these dashboards are able to give viewers a really quick view on how assets are being managed and how they're performing to be able to know what changes might need to be made in the future. So moving on from DAM and looking a little bit more on the claims and the references we talked about. So before I get started, let's talk really quickly about what I'm sure is an all too real scenario for many of you on the call here, no matter what role you've played in the development or review and approval of content. You've got a new piece of content, it's business critical, the review team needs to have a look at this and it needs to be pushed live as soon as possible. This content has a number of claims that are at the root of an overarching brand method, and these claims have been used maybe 1,000 times in 1,000 promotional pieces. But each time that content is submitted, the referencing needs to be done again. This is where this feature, auto claims linking, comes in around reducing the time and effort in substantiating claims in an automated, consistent, and accurate way by automatically applying these reference suggestions based off the claim language in the system. So that sounds great, but what does that really mean? So let's take a look at what order claims is and the hierarchy is in terms of what is set up in ProMats to set this up. So first off, we've got that claims library. So this is a collection of claims. You'll probably all know those as core claims, and you know that they'll be generated over and over again and can take forever to be reviewed and approved. So we can set this one up in Vault ProMats. And within this claims library would sit a claim. So we define claims as a group of words or phrases that make up a representation of a product, either a risk, benefit, or generally accepted fact. They're supported by literature that meets the customer's threshold for adequate substantiation to ensure that they're right. So this generally means there's a product that claim is aligned to. There's also a country, so whether a region or a country that claim is then available to or will apply to. And then you have some match text. So this is the exact set of words or phrases that Vault ProMats will look for within your content to match to this claim. So in essence, the basis of all this is Vault's going to look for this text, and then it's going to automatically apply the supporting references that have been defined in the system. And when we talk about those supporting references, this is then looking at a publication that supports those claims in your system. And then there is an anchor. And so that is those lines of text within that reference that exactly and directly support your match text. So there's a few different levels in that hierarchy to set up that need to be created, and they need to be approved within the claims library to make this available for use. But once you've done that process, you're then able, can we go next slide, John? So once you've done that process, you're then able to utilize what we call a suggested links button in ProMats. And so this essentially scrolls through the system, searches for match text instances from your claims library in that content, and then applies that reference annotation. So while previously you'd have had to go through and manually create each reference, this can then be done automatically by the system where it matches it up for you, reducing the time and the number of clicks needed to be able to get that one to work. So hopefully we've gone through, what is DAM and how that works in ProMats and what is required around the claims linking those two foundational elements. So I'll hand back over to John to go through our modular content vision.
Great. Thanks, Tessa. So again, as I said earlier on when we were setting the stage, those are features that are there today. They're available. They've been available, for customers to use. And there's many customers that have started down the path of one or many of those. When we shift to modular content is something we set out this year on the path within our roadmap in working with customers and really paving, what is the technology going to look like, again, to support the process overall for customers. So when we look at that, it's really around the idea of being able to create content once, make those combinations of content within the module itself, and we'll look at that briefly here. And then use that content across the different channels. And, when we're talking about it from an agency perspective, one of the things I always like to say here, right, is, this isn't really a lot different than how you've been working internally. You're creating your couple core pieces, and then those are getting torn apart, when you're creating an email, creating a landing page, creating a banner ad. The difference is that's all happening behind the scenes from, that's not surfaced to the customer. You're doing that internally. Your creative teams are doing that for their own efficiencies. But then in turn, there's no efficiencies from the customer perspective, because every time, even though you're saving the time internally, it's going to the customer, they're treating it as net new content. So, when we talk about the idea of how does that play out, it really gets to the point of that faster approval at the end. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two here. So really, when we talk about modular content, how it's going to be used, how, we go about creating it. It's this idea of creating this library of modules. So similarly, to the claims library where you have all your claims centralized in one spot, the idea with modules as a whole is you're able to create these modules, have the library of modules, and from a module perspective, it's a collection of assets that already exist within ProMats. So whether it be the claims, the assets, or specific text elements that you're creating to use with that module. The idea is that it's going to make reviews faster, because now instead of content being looked at as net new every time, there'll be an association with the module, with the assets. So from a reviewer perspective, they can see that, yes, this email is brand new, but it's based off 70, 80, 90% of already approved content that's out there. Again, you would have been going through that process on your own internally as you tear apart that larger piece to reuse for that email as a whole. And then, the idea is increasing content reuse, right? And there's no reason that, this shouldn't be done across the board. So as, those component assets, as the claims, as the different text elements get put into PromoMats, into these modules, there's no reason that different markets can't reuse this content, or that it's being reused for different channels, creating those efficiencies across the board. And, from an opportunity perspective, from an agency world, the execution on tactics is still going to be there. So if you're saving time in creating, those emails, it's likely going to mean that's going to open the door to, create more emails for that communication chain, or creating some other tactics, or going through a refresh of that content that you might not have been able to do because of time and resource that were spent in creating those first set of emails. Again, when we look at the bottom here, the idea of some of the numbers around, what impact modular content would have, 50% decreased time in the end-to-end content lifecycle. So when we look at it from review and approval to when it can actually get out the door. In turn, MLR reviews, 50 to 75% shorter. 75% of jobs created with modular content are approved in one review cycle, which is, something that is generally never going to happen when we're talking about creating something that's looked at as net new material. And it drives 40% content reuse across the board. So again, reusing the content that's already been created. And, how is this happening? So we've been releasing features this year as part of, our traditional roadmap for PromoMats. So in our, summer release, the ability to create and approve modules, so assemble those assets in one piece, and then generate a document that actually gets sent for MLR approval. So the idea again here is a module is a collection of assets, a collection of claims, images, text elements that live around a specific message that's not channel specific. And once that module is assembled, it then would go for its own MLR approval. And what that process is going to look like for approval will likely vary from customer to customer, depending on who they're going to have review, who they're going to have sign off on it. And then when we look at actually creating that, we've in the product already, we've updated the API that was updated as early, our first release this year, so that some of those integrations that Tessa was mentioning can take advantage of using modules. So again, the idea being, if you're in a content authoring solution that's connected to PromoMats, as you're authoring, having a library of modules. So once you choose that module, you then see all the assets that are associated with it, and then be able to bring those assets into the template or into the content that you're creating for a specific channel. That content, that final piece, getting sent back to PromoMats for review and approval, and then eventually having an association of that content to the module, to the assets specifically, so that from a reviewer perspective, they can see this email, 90% pre-approved content. Here's some of the stuff that's net new where we really need to focus our review on. So getting that out the door faster. As I wrap it up, again, just to come back to this slide, just to reiterate that modular content just isn't this thing that just happens, right? There's a lot that goes into it. But as a customer goes down this path, there's efficiencies that are created across the board just going down the path of modular content. So really getting their digital asset management strategy in a good spot, getting their claims and reference library organized, and getting that plan in place for what modular content looks like. And that's going to have a direct impact on how your teams work. But the reality of it is, I think there's more opportunity than there is anything else here for your teams, because it's going to allow you to create more, do more with the same time and resource across the board, and really drive that consistency across the brand, globally. So with that, James, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tessa. I thought the most interesting thing, I'd like to talk about it in the discussion later, is it is how we already work as content producers, behind the scenes, as developers, we have component libraries that we use, etc. This is just kind of bringing it up to a different, more visible level. So I thought it was a really interesting take-home message. We're going to jump straight to Felix now. As I said, Felix needs to leave at 1, so we're leaving it tight on time. But just a very brief introduction. Felix is the founder and medical director of medDigital and medCrowd. He's a doctor and entrepreneur. He trained as an anaesthetist, but he left that to start medDigital and medCrowd. And I've presented again with Felix a number of times, so I know this will be good value, if a little rushed because of the 1 o'clock. So over to you, Felix.
Thanks very much, James. I mean, I'm fine. I'll be able to complete the presentation by then, but it's a shame I'm going to miss the discussion afterwards. But as James mentioned, very happy to answer questions and chat to people afterwards if they do have questions to get them answered. So I've got a little presentation. I don't think the presentation has got everything in it, so very happy to answer questions and chat about additional stuff. To maybe just drop it in the chat or let the moderators know. Oops, sorry. So the key thing is we're talking about modular content, and we've had a nice presentation from the Veeva guys showing us how to kind of practically use technology to support that. But I think it's really important to put that in the context of the fact that, why are we doing it? What's the point? And just have a think about a bit more practically about how to manage that as a team, because of course the technology isn't the only solution. You've got to have the people working with the technology and using it in the right way. So I think the first thing to think about is that the environment is fast changing. It changes at different paces. Sometimes changes for the better and things go forward. Sometimes they even go backwards and people take a step back and change direction. And there's all sorts of different things that change the environment, from international conferences and news articles and competitor products being launched. And all of that changes the context within which you're publishing and developing this content. But traditionally, pharma has done its thing and been quite far behind the real world, as I like to call it. They're often kind of roughly going in the same direction, and they are responding, but often the responses are quite late, they're quite delayed, and they have to do big corrections to try and catch up. They're big companies, it's understandable, complex, big teams, lots of people, global, local kind of dynamics. But even so, pharma needs to get better, in my opinion, at kind of tracking the real world. This is an example of where they set off in a direction which is pretty accurate according to the real world. But then, of course, they realize there's a gap. Everybody kind of panics. The content they've developed and launched isn't quite right. The Salesforce campaign or the website needs to be updated. So then do a lot of replanning and talking and signing up agencies, and the gap steadily widens as their content is still out there. And then eventually they make a new plan and implement it, and you hope that it's in the right direction and that gap starts narrowing again. But often there still is a gap, and that's the problem. And what I'd like to see is pharma being much closer to the real world, not always necessarily being ahead, because that would be in certain circumstances like being able to see the future. But certainly at times they should be ahead. If they've got the big product launch and the data that they're presenting at a conference, they should know that up front, and they should be influencing the world appropriately to prescribe those medicines in the right way. And therefore they should be out there influencing people with the right information, the right content in the right place. But most of the time they'll be following the real world as a lot of the scientific and competitor and all these other things are happening. And then what you want to be doing is following the world really closely so that they can understand what's going on and adapt and change their content as they go. So in order to do this, I think there's some principles that people must follow, both the agencies and the clients that are doing this. The first thing is just get on and do it. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time planning and thinking and talking about what they're going to do. Whereas actually, often if you get started doing it, it becomes very clear what you need to do, as you start down that journey along that road. Whereas if you sit talking about the journey, often you can get sidetracked and imagine what's going to happen. And actually, the real world isn't quite what you're imagining. The second thing, and I see this a lot, is people need to minimize production effort, minimize the effort they're putting in. People are often saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice if," or "Why don't we just put that through PromoMats too?" Constantly adding work. And I think it's really important that people try and reduce that and find simple things to do and do them very well, rather than trying to do everything and then you end up doing a lot of it badly. The second thing is listen, get those real-time insights. Look at your web analytics, look at the attendees at these events, ask them what they thought of it, do advisory boards and market research surveys, find out what's going on in the real world and really listen to that to change the activities and update content, etc. And that enables you then with these three things to continuously evolve. So to evolve over time, making small adjustments as you go, rather than having to do this huge replan, which means that you're in a position where you're kind of drifting off from the real world and you have to try and desperately catch up again. And if you're making small adjustments as you go along, you can stay much closer and much more effectively, develop content much more effectively so that it really matches the needs of people out there in the real world. And of course, what that means is you can develop content faster. It responds to genuine customer needs rather than perceived customer needs. And it actually matches the business issues that teams might be facing, whether that's promotional, commercial, or customer support, medical, all these different business issues. You can develop content that matches the genuine customer needs and actually helps meet the business issues and objectives that you have through this continuous evolution. So when we think about how to do this, I like to think of it as narrowing in on optimal content. So rather than trying to hit it first time, like big hammer, small nail, bang on the head. Sure, you might do that, but usually people miss. And they might be close, but they're not on the nail. They need to tap around a bit to get closer. They need to try different things. They need to look at the web analytics to see, oh, people aren't clicking on this. Nobody's attending this event. Maybe have a look at changing some things, tweaking it a bit, changing the event title, see what happens. And then maybe refining things, getting an advisory board, and they might say, well, actually, these are the event topics that people are really interested in at the moment. So you can adapt the rest of the series of those webinar events you're running and update the presentations, maybe invite a new speaker along. So you can adjust the tail end of the events to try and increase audience attendance. You might need to simplify things. So not just adding things, more content. Think about removing content, simplifying design, getting people through to the content that really matters. You put 10 topics up there and one's really winning, get that out front so people can really see the good content and get into that engaging relationship with you so that they can then be brought into your ecosystem and start building that relationship through these interactions. And you might need to redevelop content and hopefully you'll then end up with this high click-throughs to really high quality content with the bad content being removed and the good content sitting there and being very accessible. What I think of as optimal content. And it's this adjustment over time that is critical, and using the technologies and the tools we have to get to that optimal content rather than trying to create it day one and imagining that what your perfect idea is for the content is perfect. Make sure that you check that and adapt it over time. So what is optimal content? I think one thing we need to do is define KPIs or objectives around this so that you know what is optimal content for you. It's not some objective thing that anybody can come in and say, oh yeah, that's optimal. It depends on the context, depends on the business issues you face, depends on the customer needs. But generally, it's got to be relevant, so timely. It's got to go out there, relevant. It's got to be meeting the needs of the people who are consuming it, who are watching those videos or reading that text. It's got to be meaningful to them. It must be engaging. It must be light, easy to read. Maybe make it out there so that people can share it with other people easily. They can forward emails or share it on social media if appropriate for your content, so they can engage with it and help other people engage with it. Timely, I mean, my aspiration is for Pharma to be able to produce content in hours, not weeks. And we've done that at conferences. We've got blog posts out on the day, which are relevant to that day, and they're available for people to see and interact with and read, in the moment when it actually is relevant and important. And of course, it's got to be compliant. And this is a big stumbling block. But I find that compliance is actually usually the smallest part of it, if you can do everything else well, because compliance is ticking the box on content that is already very, very good. And modular content, where you're combining things together, means that's been done ahead of time. So therefore, you're not having to do it in the heat of the moment, and it's putting delays into the content production. So let's have a think about how to get immediate feedback. So the first thing to do is have a look at page views. We've mentioned, if it's in social media, look at shares and likes, and check to what people are saying. And if you can't see that because it's not publicly accessible, you can't see these kind of web metrics and engagements, then show it to people. Get customers into an advisory board online, or do some market research on your content, and do little checks regularly. And that will help you really understand what people think of it. And so what we do is we gather real-time insights along our content development process to help that path to optimal content. We might have an expert team we're working with, people who've been working in the area for a long time in company or in the agency. People who've got a lot of experience in that therapy area. And I think it's a great place to start, and you shouldn't forget that usually people, if they're going to hit that nail, they can hit it pretty close because they know what's relevant and important. But it's that extra 10 or 20% that comes from talking to customers, looking at the analytics, potentially doing these market research advisory boards, these specific insight collection or discovery activities. And that's where you get that content from very good to excellent, because you tip it over the edge and get that little subtle feedback of, actually, if you add this angle in, or consider this study, or you've forgotten to talk about this part of the topic, which is really relevant to patients. That's where you can really increase the power of content. So what we do is we do regular weekly meetings, touch points all the time, constantly reviewing materials and content to adapt it and improve it. And if we don't need them, we just cancel them. If there's no new content or nothing's happened, it doesn't matter. But if you've got them in the diary, then they happen when you need them to happen. Sometimes we do that on a Monday or earlier in the week, and we get the content through and approved by that weekend. So we might be getting emails that are going out on a regular basis, or website content that's updated in pieces over time, rather than trying to do this massive production kind of publication, which can be very difficult to do when you've got a huge job bag that's going to take the reviewers weeks to go through all the content. Do little bits that you're then adding in. And you can plan ahead. You can look at content coming. You can think there's a conference coming up, there's a product launch, competitor product launch. You can start planning that content, start writing it, getting ahead of it, rather than doing things, oh no, we've got this thing next week, and then suddenly having to rush and create it. And I see so many people firefighting content rather than sitting back and looking ahead and doing simple things very well. They're doing huge things, and goes over time, goes over budget, and then they're trying to firefight and catch up all the time, which doesn't develop good content. It's usually a rush to get everything out the door. So to do that, you need to simplify things, as I mentioned before, do little things quickly, try and find the easiest way to do it, not the hardest. It's usually not nice to put that other thing through approval. It's not nice to develop an extra thing that you don't need. So stick to what you need, and have smaller plans that you do better, rather than bigger plans that you don't do so well. I also find people often debating rules. Check the SOPs, get them in front of you, look at what they say. If they're not good enough, feedback and get them rewritten. So you really do know what the rules are and they're clear, because that can really help you make sure that you're nailing the content really, really well. And I always say, do we really need to certify that? Often you don't. Often things don't even need to be certified or examined. They're not Salesforce briefings or promotional materials that need to be certified, but people are doing it because they're worried that they might miss something. So having a think about how we can use these technologies and things to do modular content, I think it's really important that we separate things into different sections, really. I think of it like a mail merge. Here is an example of email merge. So where you've got the email, and then you've got the personalized content to somebody, and see you later, meet at your clinic, maybe from a sales force, a sales rep. It could be a promotional email. And you're going to that person with this email saying, hi, we're going to meet and have this promotional meeting. And that's quite straightforward, and you can imagine that. And I certified, letters, mailings going out where you've got a template letter and an address book of an Excel spreadsheet, whatever, and it's going to be merged later and sent out in the mailing house. And I think of this in a very similar way. So you're combining content, it then goes out the door. And signatories often say to me, you can't do that. You've got to see the final form. And I say, well, did you, when we sent out those 1,000 letters last week or 5 years ago, did you check every single one to make sure the address was right on the top? And they're like, no. You're like, well, no, we've been doing this for years. We've been doing modular content for years. And the point is the company has a process in the mailing house where there's somebody there who's tasked with checking that those letters are correct according to the job bag. Often they're an AQP, an appropriate qualified person, but they're there checking that those letters that were certified in an electronic job bag online actually go out the door correctly. So I believe that modular content is not new. But let me make it more complicated. Let's think about how we can do this digitally for digital content. So this is an example of a conference blog post. So before the conference, you can have these pieces of content already written and certified. New clinical data. It could be the company's own product with the latest research. They've known about it for 6 months with the statisticians working on it, R&D, developing the slides. A few weeks before the conference, you can get those slides from R&D or from the statisticians about that study, and you can write the content you want to write. And you can certify that, have it all referenced and tidy and absolutely perfect. And sometimes that needs to come with some specific standard efficacy warnings or safety warnings, the things that make that compliant. And so they need to be combined. And you might have those both signed off differently, or you might have them as one piece of modular content. It doesn't really matter. But you can think of like having the logo and the black triangle, the generic name, prescribing information. Those are kind of pieces that must all come together into this final piece. But all of that can be certified weeks before the conference if you get organized. Whereas I found as a medic, I was often certifying it the day before the conference or a week after the conference when we'd known about this data, this product, this new data coming for a long time. And then you can have some standard content that you've written beforehand about the conference. It's going to be this conference in Sydney or wherever it is. You can talk about a little summary of, it's great to see everybody at the conference, really nice. And you can write some really generic stuff that is probably not even promotional, but it's going to be used promotional. You can certify that as well. So you can have kind of generic content that you've kind of pre-prepared. And you can run that past the signatories. So then on the day, what you do is you say, well, look, this content, this presentation was made, the big presentation about the data. We're going to now write a blog post about it. We've got the majority of the stuff already certified, and we're going to just finish the introduction and the summary based on the context on the day. Who said what the questions were after the presentation, and what people said in the conference foyer afterwards, chatting about that data. And we can then contextualize it and adapt the intro and summary based on what actually happened at the day. And then you can combine that with the pieces you've got from beforehand, and the medic can very quickly review it. So they're reviewing some very simple intro and summary content, which might be adapted on the day and they have to certify. But they're putting in stuff they've already seen, the standard stuff about the medicine and about that study, which they've already done before. So they can combine that and then they can certify that one piece on the day, which is much easier because that blue section in the middle was all certified before the conference, and they don't have to do that on the day. And that makes a huge difference when it comes to publishing content quickly. And of course, the content store, there's different ways of storing content, but you need to put it somewhere and tag it so you can find it again. So you can reuse that content many times and put them not just in conference blogs, but also in things like web pages, emails, etc. And so you can reuse that blue content again and again. And you just maybe putting it in different context. You can certify that context each time, combine it, and get it live. So hopefully, I've kind of just had a chat about how I see modular content really working, and hopefully giving you some context about how to do that practically when working with your team. And I think it really does reduce the time to get things published. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do, you can take a shortcut on getting the content reviewed. Often you still need to certify it. You can certify it in the cold light of day before you need it, and then reuse it, so you don't have to re-certify it each time from scratch. And you can segment things into different sections, combine them on the day to make these new assets, whether that's a blog post, an email, or a website. And then you can also test that across different devices as well. So I've gone through quite quick, but hopefully that's useful. I think there's a few questions in chat. So what I'll do is I'll just have a look down.
Yeah, there's one for you, Felix, from Yuri, which is be great if we could grab you before you shoot off, and we can surface it again with Tessa and John. But based on your experience, was there any specific or favourable business rules by pharma clients for content assembly approval?
So for me, I think it's about having. I always talk about structure and content. So you have fixed structure with things that aren't going to change often. And then you're dropping the content into it. And the skill is to reuse that content. So you get it certified with everything it needs, whether that's a prescribing information link or a black triangle, any safety and efficacy warnings, so that you have a kind of standalone piece that you can kind of drop into an email or a blog or a website, a kind of generic piece of content. And if that piece stands alone, you can then reuse it many times. And you can just change the context with these kind of little intro and summary, top and tail it, and then the top and tail does the context without having to rewrite the actual content. And I find that works quite well for product content, which is often very kind of technical. So therefore you can't change it much anyway. So the skill is don't. I hope that might answer the question.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, right? I don't know if John or Tessa have anything in this space, but like so I really liked your point that we've been doing modular content for years, right? And Veeva approved emails are a prime example of that, where you've got templates and fragments, etc. And it's a bit like if you just spring it on the MLR team at the last minute and then try and explain it, and it's for a webinar that's tomorrow, and you need to get it approved. And actually, but if you roll that right back to a less time pressured project, bring stakeholders. We're fantastic as an industry managing our external stakeholders, our trialists, HCPs, KOLs. We spend so much effort to bring them on board with what we're doing. But very often we completely forget about our internal customers that are key stakeholders on this. And the last thing you want to do is drop, as you say, a giant job bag or an urgent job bag that's to get your head around like the day before it's needed, etc. So for me, it's a lot about stakeholder management. But I don't know if John, Tessa, you have anything to add to that in terms of content assembly approval rules or business rules?
Yeah, so I mean, I can say from our perspective, from a pure technology platform perspective, so with the creation of modules, we allow for those instructions for use and kind of the rule sets as a whole. So for example, anytime a claim or an asset is associated with the module, one of the first things that can be set up in the module itself is the fact that there's a checkbox that it must be used. So if somebody's coming to that module, and let's say there's 5 different assets there around imagery or things to that effect, or maybe there's 10 different text elements, it's very clear to them which ones must be used if they're actually leveraging that module. And then beyond that, we have actually the ability to put in rule sets. So whether that be instructions for use, like text size on specific access labels can be a minimum of this, or if this asset's used, this asset must be used, type of thing. So we are supporting that in the modules themselves to be able to have that roll up from a review and approval perspective of that module as well.
In my illustration, those are the tags. So what you're doing is you're doing attributes around the content to make sure that everyone knows if it's promotional, non-promotional, if it's which products are. You can set up the rules around it, and that's really good because then you can find the content again and reuse it. And if you do that well, it makes it a lot easier. And the second discipline is not tweaking it. So many people, they write the standard content, get it certified, and they just make minor text changes to it when they reuse it in a blog, which don't actually make a big difference. And if you can stop yourself doing that, you can use content as is, and you can do this kind of assembly, which works very well.
There is another question from Yuri, but I'm going to save that because we've got Felix for like 2 minutes. I just wanted to ask you this before you go, Felix. If you look ahead 3 years from now, where the technology has been established and we're getting to this modular content, what impact would you say it would have on a day-to-day role for a brand manager or an agency lead? what's going to be different in 3 years in how we work?
I think it's quite clear to me that digital content is the future. I mean, I say future like it isn't already. This idea that we're going to be writing lovely long form articles or letters or whatever is gone. People need short, tangible, scannable pieces of content. It needs to be published very quickly and get out the door. And in order to do that, people need to change the way they work. And they need to work with modular content, in my opinion. They can't carry on writing everything from scratch each time. It just isn't feasible. And therefore, they need to make this move. But if they do it well, their time will be spent, less time will be spent doing approvals and more time will be spent on content generation.
Yeah, this is very much my view that no one likes PI changes. Like no one likes the grind of reproducing content. That I joined a creative agency, creative industry. Why am I slogging through content instead of so? I think I agree that the budgets are going to remain, but those budgets could be better placed for the more creative side of what we do. So Felix, thank you very much for presenting and bringing it back to modular content. I appreciate you've got to fly. I will pass on any questions, and of course you can find Felix on LinkedIn with a quick search if you want to reach out directly to him. So thanks very much, Felix.
Thanks
so much, James. It's been a pleasure being here, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
So you already had a follow-up question, which is good for yourself, John and Tessa, which is, can we manually configure such checklists and boxes function within Vault and PromoMats?
Yeah, so I mean, the checkboxes that I was talking about around must use and the rule sets themselves, those are standard to the modular content functionality that's already in PromoMats. So in the creation of a module, the must use, it's already there. The ability to put in those rule sets are going to be there already. And then so the customization comes into play when that actual module is built out. So when assets are associated, if they must be used, you can use that checkbox. If there's specific rule sets, those can be input as well with when the module is being created.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Mr. Wade. Hi, Chris. What does the panel feel to be the optimal level of Thanks for this word, Chris. What does the panel feel to be the optimal level of componentization, thank you, for client use? Felix spoke of reusable modules that have already been approved and used that a customer could safely drop into a new piece. But each module is made up of components that could be dynamically changed based on personalization requirements. This is a great question because we haven't really touched on, we alluded to, but really touched on the personalization. If we are wanting to head as an industry to personalized interactions with customers that aren't led by a rep who's manually customizing that experience, modular content and components are obviously key. I don't know if you can speak to that, John, about what the optimal level of componentization is twice.
Yeah, so as far as building out the component library, right? I mean, that's something we've talked a lot about with agencies that came to us very early on as customers started to talk to them about modular content, about, digital asset management as a whole. Is now what does that process look like? And, there was concern there of, are we building out the components to then eventually roll up to that larger piece as a customer goes down this path of modular content? And I don't think that's going to be the way it's going to work. It's going to be, similarly when I talked about the feature itself, or using modular content as a whole, it's going to be building out those larger pieces and then harvesting the content out of those, right? And that's going to build out the component library. And what that process looks like is going to probably vary depending on the life cycle of the brand, where it is in its campaign, if it's going to be coming up against a campaign refresh and stuff. Now, I think beyond that, Chris, to your question around how do then those assets become personalized, I think that's unknown at this point, right? I think, maybe that, and I don't know that whether that's going to happen in PromoMats specifically, or if that's going to happen with some sort of integration. And if it happened with that integration, then it becomes more of the MLR teams actually getting comfortable with the fact of this is what we're approving, knowing that this part of it or these aspects of it are going to change, with these different variables, whatever the considerations there, are around whatever the personalization is.
Yeah, I think that's it's a tough one, and I wish Felix could have stayed, because final form certification, what is final form when we're talking about modular content? A prime example of that, even a few years ago, as I said, Veeva approved emails, you can see as the modular content, right, that are coming together between the template, which is the Dear Doctor, and the PI at the bottom, and the adverse event reporting, and then you drop the fragments in, which are the different links to documents or claims. And I think we built one, there were 2 templates and 15 shared fragments. So just the combination, when someone said, can we have screenshots of final form for each of those combinations? You don't have to think long before that's like several hundred, I think even thousands of potential views. And it's like, we can't have personalized content and final form. And it's a shame, as I say, that Felix is not here, but that's, for me, is the biggest stakeholder setting of MLR processes to move out of final form into, this idea that it's different for everyone that looks at it. Do you? I had a, just leading on to that, we're really in this sort of transformative space when we're looking at personalized content. Well, I think we are, if I remember from your slide. Can you share any of the sort of, let's say, our end clients and pharma companies that are really living the principles of transformative content? Are they there, and what's are they seeing those benefits that you put along the bottom?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look back to that, the journey to content maturity, I think we're still really in most part in that middle bucket. So we're not to that transformative stage yet. I think we're getting to the point of being able to set the stage to get there. And then, one of the things I wanted to build on from what you were saying too, is the other part of it as well, is that the MLR teams need to get comfortable with the fact of this stuff is going to come back in for approval, right? It's not that they approve this module and then people are going to go use that module and start pumping out this content they're never going to see again. The idea is it's setting the framework, setting the stage for them to be able to be more efficient in creating the tactic, but ultimately it is going to come back through, go through recertification, go through final approval. So there is that aspect of it as well. But as far as, what does that look like from pumping out dynamic content quicker? I know there's conversations happening. I know there's different tactics happening today, the exploration of them. As far as what does that look like? For example, I've had a couple conversations around a customer that's looking to do personalized videos from the rep to HCPs, and they're putting the framework in place of how to be able to support that. And they're actually getting pretty far down the path with it. So it looks like it's something that's going to come to fruition. But, that's something that maybe even 2 years ago probably would have never gotten further than kind of concept. So I think we are getting there. And I do think, the realization setting in that it's where we need to go to. We need to get there. We need to evolve. And, it really comes down to more around process and education of those internal teams, of those internal customers, like you said, James, that, really need to be familiar and on board with all of this.
It's a very good point you make, that it's not like they're not going to see it again. I mean, I think for true personalized content, there is variability there that you maybe won't exactly see, but in the early stages of modular content, it's not that I'm signing this off and God knows what happens to it, right? It will come back. And I liked both yourselves and Felix both brought it back to things that we already do. Like we're already doing something like this. And again, Felix showed the email, etc. But PI is another example. Now there's often PI held on a website or the iComply app or a central PI that you link to. You've signed that off, and we're in essence linking to it. So that's already kind of modular. I mean, it's not really what we're talking about now, but as a principle for what am I signing off, I know that PI is actually the one that's up on iComply and has been signed off. So the fact that this links to it, you're starting that journey. So I think it's quite helpful if we think about bringing our MLR teams along this journey, is to not say look at the bright different future so much as it's an evolution of things that we're already doing, with the understanding that this is the direction of travel. I don't think any of us, as Felix left us with, this is where we're going, and we have to, if we want to keep up with the extraordinary content. But what was it, 80% increase in content? I think we've seen we've never been busier. I know the team at Salamander are really busy with content. Everyone wants more and more content. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable from a budget perspective. It's not sustainable from a resource internally, like asking the MLR teams. As much as, I don't know if we've got anyone from MLR teams in the audience, but they're often the kicking tree. They're the kicking tree, not even a word. The people we get cross with because they're blocked, but we're just throwing so much at them now. So modular content definitely for me. I have a question from Sophie. Are the claims and modular functions available for all customers, or those claims and add-ons are personalized to a customer's instance of PromoMats? Yep. So I think what we're getting at here is it licensed, and our reference is unique to individual customers?
Yep, it's a great question. So from a feature perspective, specifically claims, auto claims linking, modular content, these are all product enhancements from a PromoMats perspective. So if a customer is paying for PromoMats, they have the ability to leverage these features and functions as part of their license. Now, generally, there's some work that needs to go into some of these things, right? So, with claims, with modular content, with digital asset management, there's work that needs to go in from an implementation and configuration perspective, but also more so on the process side. What does that process look like? What is the optimal process that they should be working in? And that's more of where the time and resource comes into play, more so than the product or the feature itself. So no, there's no licensing per these different features, but it's more, how are they going about the process change and the implementation? And if they're doing that internally, then obviously time and resources less. But if they're leaning on Veeva or they're leaning on one of our services partner, that's where that comes into play as well.
Well, process and technology, really important. Tessa, I really liked your making it very clear. DAM is a process or a process. Don't know why I've got American suddenly. DAM is a process, and the PromoMats is the technology. One thing you talked about the value of having it in a single platform is the content reporting, right? So again, John, I have this mental block. I can never remember which company it is that begins with G that have been doing really good digital asset management, where the agencies are rated on how well they are doing at uploading the right content and tracking it. Is it Genentech? I can never remember. Genentech, I'll try and remember for next time. But Tessa, I wondered if you want to just expand on what is the value of reporting on content and keeping it within a system, so we don't have to download it, re-upload it, and lose that sort of continuum of information. But why is content reporting of value to agency and industry?
So in terms of the value in there, a couple of the points I made during the presentation is around the use of individual assets. So understanding where those have been made of use. So an obvious one is if something is expired or needs to be changed. If you don't know where something's being used, you're at risk of not updating it. There's a lot more time in terms of making that change to content. So that is the case whether or not you're looking at the assets being reused in a final form within Vault, or if it's an asset being reused in a website, in a social media post, and anything else. By having that continuity and that connection between what's happening with your content, you've got visibility on that. And so that's a really big part of it. And you've got a lot more transparency around the time it takes for approvals to be done, for content to be created and used. So it's more around the knowledge of what's happening with your content to be able to then make decisions and make changes and make updates.
Yeah, and just to build on that, it's really that traceability and visibility. So, the idea being, so if we fast forward to, let's say, a year from now, and we look at a customer that's using modules across the board, those modules have a claim associated with it. So let's say that claim gets updated of some reason, the data changed. It's very easy at that point to then go in, look at that claim, see every tactic that claim is used, and then knowing what needs to go through updates. Similarly, when we talk about a module, if it's an asset of some sort, so maybe it's an asset that's tied to that data change, a chart, very easily being able to see everywhere that asset's used in what tactics, knowing what they're up against as far as what needs to be updated. Instead of having to go through that kind of scramble of what's impacted. Now, with a couple of clicks, pulling up a report, very easily being able to see that.
Yeah, so again, sort of bringing it back to things we're already experienced with. PI is a good example of that. We were in a call with a client, and there was just this blind panic about where all the different PIs lived and what linked to where, and these different systems that emails used a web link and the app used an iComply link and other stuff. And it was just this whole, wouldn't it be nice just to reduce that down? And I often ask this to our agency partners, is do you really value the revenue stream that comes from PI updates, or would you rather be taking, and is it a real revenue stream? Because no one wants to pay it just seems like no good value, right? It seems to be a PI change and just one aspect has to change. And all of this cycle of work and effort gets in place. And I have to say, I know a few people have left the industry recently because they felt that it's just become a content factory. It's become a churn of content, and it's that sort of content, PI updates, and that stuff that's really not why they signed up to a creative agency. It's not why they signed up to a medcoms and where they want to look at the science, not PI updates and stuff like that. So if we can use one thing to really help people see the value of this, there's obviously so much more value than that. But just to say, like, you don't have to bother with those things so much anymore. That can be tracked. You know where everything is. And as you say, if we can get to the point where it's not just updating the PI, but updating the claims, and then that just flags everything that needs to be looked at. Just thinking about how much time that saves. Time equals money. That money can go elsewhere to more interesting things. Christine, you had a question that you posted around integration, maybe with other channels like SEO, etc.
Yeah, just how does modular content sort of help or affect the optimization for SEO? Whether that's something that's factored in, because obviously a lot of the stuff that we do for clients can go online and can go on their website. And to your points earlier, we do all the assets that we create. We ensure that we can show our clients how to repurpose and reuse and take out sections and take out assets within assets, if you like, to echo what that message might be. So if that whole piece is being approved, then you can repurpose it and reuse it in lots of different ways. But yeah, how does this sort of modular content affect SEO, basically, was my question.
I think from my perspective, I think it provides the opportunity to have some more consistency across all the teams that are working with the content, right? So if we think about a module is going to roll back up likely either to a core claim or to a specific message around that brand. And then it comes into the process overall, from the ability to supply text elements, so headers, subheads, et cetera. If those are all standardized across the board and there aren't, variations between those depending on how somebody picked it up and how somebody used it. Or, maybe part of that brand's process is for each message or for the main messages, there's some sort of SEO resource, SEO document that gets created and uploaded into PromoMats, and then that gets associated to the modules themselves. So that way, anybody that's going to use that module has that reference right there firsthand to be able to go see, this is how we should be doing it, this is what we should be doing.
Yeah, that would definitely save a lot of time and make sure that you're not doubling up on your efforts. It's great.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. We're just working on a project at the moment where it's a global development for a sales aid that's going to be localized in different markets. The model is for local Veeva developers to do the localization, but there's a real focus on making that easy. So we're producing source code that's annotated. It's not usual to give away source code, but this is all part of the thing, right? But along with that, it's going to become like a site map, so the equivalent, if you like, of that SEO documentation that goes around it. So site maps, deployment forms, annotated code, localization, the InDesign files, etc., all going as part of this localization package. And we ended up having this weird circular discussion about where that should sit. Should it be a WeTransfer, a SharePoint, and all the rest of it? You're kind of like, hang on, this is like it's a Veeva project, right? Shouldn't, it's almost like there's something you've got right in front of you that could kind of do this distribution out, and they haven't got brand portal set up. But it leads me to this question of again referring back to this digital asset management piece with Genentech. Is that right? Anyway, where they were, I'm now panicking, I've forgotten again, where they actually rate the agencies in terms of speed of upload, not speed of upload, but how quickly things are approved. I know that's a confounding factor of how good the MLR team, but how well has it been referenced, how many knockbacks there are, have they uploaded the artwork that goes with it, etc. Have they associated the associated documents, etc. And there's like a score, if I remembered rightly, which you listen to this and you think, oh, well, what we're now going to be measured. But then if you're a good agency, then you're going to score better. Than it's another opportunity to shine, I think, digital asset management and being on the sort of, as Christine is saying, if you go to the effort of making sure you help your clients see the repurpose value of components and how it's done, and it's kind of how we work as well from a development point of view, then this is just the logical progression of that making sure the people that pay for this stuff have it housed somewhere for reuse and repurposing.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. And while it sounds like it might be more work from an agency perspective, the reality of it is, there might be some more upfront work in the time of uploading, because now you're going from just uploading a PDF to uploading source files, uploading or associating component assets, but there's, the features, the functions that are there, are meant to make that as quick and efficient as possible. And it's more of just you making sure that a customer is utilizing those to be able to really take full advantage of that. So,
well, I know we've got a few agencies on the call. I can see a few names I recognise. I wondered if it's just a moment to talk about the InDesign integration. Obviously, it's a big player in agency life. There's this constant debate around artwork or code and which gets approved, etc. But I thought, the idea of asset management components, and speaking to Chris's earlier question of how small is the optimal componentization, but I thought it was really interesting when I learned about the InDesign and Adobe integrations.
Yeah. So we have a feature that's really just allows for, so if if the final piece is being created in InDesign, we have the ability for your teams to actually upload the InDesign package. And so when that happens, not only does it upload, the viewable rendition of that document, it also goes out and looks at all the different pieces that are part of that InDesign package. So whether they be Illustrator, Photoshop, image files, and then it looks at that against what component assets already exist in PromoMat. So, let's take a detail aid, for example. You upload that, that's going to have a bunch of components that come along with it. As part of the upload process, PromoMats will go out and look and say, okay, is there, maybe this isn't a net new detail aid, it's a refresh. And so therefore a good chunk of the component assets already exist in the library. It's going to create the connection between that file you're uploading and those already existing assets, and you're very quickly going to be able to see what the status of those existing component assets are. And then with any new assets that it's not discovering a match for, it will upload those and classify them as auto-linked. So then they are there. So either you, as part of the process, if the customer has to go down that path, or their librarian or something to that effect, will then make those other component assets available for use for other agencies. But again, all of that then happens by uploading the one zip package and clicking next a couple times to get that content up there.
It's clients. Sorry, I call them clients. You would call them customer. Other people. It's the pharma companies basically taking all those components up and then seeing where else they can be. So that happens across agencies. So that's an interesting thing around, licensing and rights and stuff. What's the no, I'm not going to get into that for this one. Do you know what? I'm bearing in mind the time. That's just a whole, which is fonts. Who's fonts? I'm gonna unless there's any other questions, I can't see any other questions coming. I'm gonna leave us with a little bit of time to spare, but I'm gonna ask one last question of you, John and Tessa, which is the one I asked Felix before he had to scoot, which is, if you take yourselves in, like us, 3 years into the future, what do you think's changed in the day-to-day role of a brand manager or someone in agency when it comes to the content aspect of their day?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, it's just looking at content differently, right? So again, it's part of that is, I look back to when I was on the agency side, it was those constant battles of, you're going into these same MLR teams and putting something forward and it's being looked at net new. And so there's, we're doing this detail aid over here with these features and functions for this brand. And then we go to a different brand within that customer and, we're coming up against pushback. It can't work that way. And so it's from content aside, from the actual approval content side, but just the way something functions and the features and stuff that you can do with it. There's that piece of it. So I think it's looking at content differently. And having, part of this whole process is getting those content standards in place, getting buy-in to, this is how an email is going to look. Here are options for emails from within a customer environment, or here's how detail aids and things are going to work. And then when it gets into the briefing process, I think that's where it's going to change as well for both brand managers and for agencies. Now, once these modules are there, once these module libraries are built out, when looking at a tactic, a creation of something, it's going to be, we have these modules available to go look at. Again, it doesn't just mean it's going to be taking that and there's not going to be any creative freedom within that. It's going to be looking at what can be leveraged from that and then pulling that forward and doing what you need to with it. And then what else can you evolve on from it? But I think ultimately, it's going to allow us to get more done with the same time and resource. And I think that was always something that was, big on our side, especially, just take email, for example. If we were looking at putting a CRM email campaign together, one of the things we always got handcuffed with is the actual cost that it took to get an email out the door. We had to cut back on what the ideal communication frequency would be able to be supported within budget, within the time to get something approved. So now if we can get to a point where, we can cut down 50% of the time spent in creating and approving an email, and now that means if we can get double the emails out, now we're actually doing, something from a strategic standpoint of getting more messaging, getting more content in front of that customer as a whole.
Tessa, do you have anything on that?
I mean, obviously, what John said is something I very much agree with. I think the only thing I'd add in addition to that is we touched a little bit on the concept of personalized content, which we're doing today. As you've said, we're doing it in emails. It's starting in things like detail aids where you're pulling in data, you're making it slightly different per HCP. But I think that is something that is going to continue. And so it's going to be less about looking at a complete final form piece of everything you do and looking at what those individual messages are that could be tweaked, that could be, used in terms of the order in which you display them is slightly different depending on how someone's accessed it. And so it's looking less at a final form piece of content and looking at those modules, those components, and making sure the messaging is okay to then be used in multiple ways.
Good. Well, yeah, that perfect segue into where I was going to kind of close with my view on modular content. When I first heard it, I thought it's going to take all the creativity out. What are our client, our agency partners going to do for revenue if there's some big global agency just producing all these components and all you're going to do is you have to use them here and you have to use them there. The more I've learned about this space, the more I've realized that it's quite the opposite, that actually, that stuff wasn't the stuff we enjoy doing. It doesn't bring the value. It's not good ROI to recreate it. And the thing that you said there, John, which rings oh so true, is where the content's used in two places, but a different team approve it, that changes, then that impacts, and this has to change. I mean, even to the point where we've got detail aids that are for one's for primary care, one's for secondary care. It's exactly the same data, but it gets approved differently, and you just see them diverging for no good reason whatsoever. So for me, the removal of the drudge and that we can do more for the same in the same time and for the same budget is really important. I think a really important finding from this. But even more so is, to your point, Tessa, is that personalized engagement. We talk about it a lot about customer journeys, the sort of personas, but also I think we can do now with increasing technology. We can take this idea of here's 3 segmented personas about how our customers react to content and the sort of content we should share with them, all the way with technology we can take that down to the individual customer level. We don't have to make up these sort of personas, well, we do to plan, but we can actually move those personas to an actual individual customer journey where the rep and technology can respond to their interests and needs with personalized content. And that's where I hope we'll be knocking on that door in 3 years' time. There's a way to go. There's a lot of friction in the system. There's a lot of training and buy-in and stuff that needs to be done. But I'd like to think in 3 years' time, we will be having much more personalized interactions with customers. So on that note, with 3 minutes to spare, I'm going to call this to a close. Thank you so much, John and Tessa, for the presentation and for the discussion. To Georgia and Nick for organising it, Christine for chairing or opening it, and for asking the right questions. So thank you, everybody, and we will announce the next event once we've planned out what it is, which we kind of do as we go. But it's been great to see everyone back, and thank you ever so much.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all soon. Thanks for coming, guys. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.